Good afternoon and welcome to the first AZAPO political education webinar, online political education webinar. Today is the 17th of January. It's the 60th anniversary of the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, a day which shall live in infamy amongst all Africans, amongst all people who love freedom, liberty, and justice. Perhaps fittingly today, we are joined by Africa advocate Sipho Mantula, or Ras Gideon as some would know him. Comrade Sipho is a Pan-African cultural activist, a Pan-African historian, a Pan-African human rights defender. Currently, he is attached to the newly established Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs at the University of South Africa. On the media, I'm sure most of you have seen him, some dating back to the days when he used to host a show on reggae, if I remember correctly, in Africa. Currently, he has been consistently contributing to national media on programs such as SAFM Sunrise, breakfast show Mondays, Monday to Friday at 6:35. Africa, you're welcome. So the discussion in Talking to Africa, we decided to have just a broad discussion that covers the theme of elections, democracy, and governance in 2021 and beyond. This was motivated by the fact that 2020 has been I would say, a defining year. A lot of things have changed. Yet a lot of things have stayed the same even during a pandemic. So we thought we'd just have a broad discussion that goes global and continental and to our own country. Excuse me, and would definitely, because of the nature of the discussion, would definitely welcome participation by everyone. So as to make this discussion lively, remember, you own this platform. This is your platform. We bring guests so that they can shed light on many things, but it's through your participation that the true value of this discussion will come out. As it's standard in terms of format, I'll use Ras Gideon and advocate Sipho interchangeably as the discussion, whichever comes to mind first. I will use that. I hope you're okay with that. As it is with our standard format, what we will do is that Ras Gideon will first give a presentation. From there, we will tease certain things, and then we will allow all you comrades and viewers and participants in this platform to share in the discussion. Advocate Sipho, over to you.
Africa Kianeboha, Jambo Africa, Molweni, Sani Bonani, Ma Africa, in a very important moment, as the tower have said. I'm greeting all those who are following us, who are listening to this reasoning, this interaction, which I'm very humbled and grateful that being your first political session or political school, we thought that if we can look back at these three pillars, which has defined the neo-colonial state, it has defined the post-colonial state. And at the same time, one is looking back at what we have mentioned, that we cannot go unnoticed without remembering Patrice Emery Lumumba, who was maliciously assassinated on this day 60 years ago. And still, there is no change to the sons and daughters of the Great Lakes in Congo. Beyond the minerals that have been looted by the imperialists, what we are seeing is that even democracy has failed in that country. One doesn't speak from Google to DRC. One has been to that country during transition. South Africa played a role as well in the engagement of Congo. But in my thought of analysis, in my train of analysis, moving from paying tribute to Patrice Emery Lumumba, I think it will be correct for us to as well remember all the gallant fighters of this country, Abo Ntate Drej Kaluki Koka, onkgopotsa Abraham Ramuchibitiro, umuntu Mieza Kashezi, Tsietsi wa Mashinini, all the gallant fighters of AZAPO, even those who are still alive, our elders who have been keeping this issue of Black consciousness. Because I think what is missing even in democratic spaces is the national consciousness of understanding concepts, understanding practices, understanding democracy. That if you talk of democracy, elections becomes the vehicle to it. But others, they say it is a Washington consensus, Thabo, of 1998. So in my frame, I will take back to Ethiopia. It was in 1973, almost 48 years ago. There was a question posed to the then emperor and the founding member of the Organization of African Unity, Emperor Haile Selassie, to say, in your opinion, what is democracy? In his answer was that, but democracy, republic, what does these two words signify? Have they changed the lives of the ordinary people? Have they brought any change to the livelihood, any conditions? And in his own conclusion and inference, he said, but democracy in Africa, it is harmful and it is a mistake. So defining democracy through the lens of Haile Selassie brings me back home to Anthony Mzwake Limbede, who defined African democracy. And I cannot go to the issue of traditional Khotla to say democracy can be defined as the government of the people by the people. That's a Greek philosophy. That's a stolen African philosophy. Democratic spaces that we are living in today, Thabo, and looking at my train of thought was that I look at Africa defining democracy, but in democracy, there is a democratic elections that have to supersede good governance. But in most African countries, we have bad governance, the mismanagement, we have corruption, we've got independent, dependent electoral commissions. So if you think of democracy, who should be the vehicle of putting voter education? Who should be doing national consciousness of understanding this concept of democracy and elections? It's your election management board, which is your electoral commissions across Africa, across the world. And they are not perfect. They are flawed, they are fraught, they are appointed by the president, they have loyalty to the ruling party. Now, the key mistake that democracy has brought in this African continental, it has brought the social elites, it has brought the ruling elites to think about themselves and their own families. And they have left their citizens and populations squandering out there, being wandering wanderers in their own soil. If I look at the question of elections in South Africa, as we are speaking, Thabo, this morning I saw an article on City Press, a call for submission and hearing on our electoral amendment bill. And this bill, it takes back to 3 bills of a bill of 1996, the Electoral Commission as a body, its powers is going through amendment. I don't know how many of our people are about to Bagiti Patubaron, how many do they know? Or they post these adverts on the English newspapers. Our African language radio stations don't understand electoral democracy. They only know voter education campaign because we are in a campaigning year. Despite the COVID, Africa has been doing campaigns. There have been elections. Last year, there were elections in Burundi, Malawi. Many African countries went through elections, including the imperialist USA went to the elections. Despite that, there were high numbers of COVID in that country. But America went to an election under the cloud of COVID, and Africa as well went under the cloud of elections of Ghana that we saw end of the year. We just recently saw elections in Uganda, on Thursday. So there's no way we can ignore even that the election environment in this African continent, in the globe, is not very conducive because it is a neo-colonial project. That is my take, Thabo, this afternoon. That an election project in the African continent is a neo-colonial project. Some of our leaders, maybe if I can have to quote Professor Kwesi Kwapra, just yesterday, within 12 hours, in our session with him, both of us, we came into a clear conclusion that most of our African leaders, either they are aware that they are saving European colonial project on election, democracy, and governance based on World Bank, IMF, United Nations development structures, because UNDP supports elections in the African continent. But no one has asked why. Because elections is a market-driven project for the neo-imperialists. So if you look at those broader structures that I've mentioned, they're the ones supporting elections. Now, African leaders, either they are aware, but if they are not aware, then what then is the role of political parties? What then is the role of grounded intellectuals? What then is the role of the public media? Because that's where we need to unmask, make the political electoral system naked to say that this is a neo-colonial project. Because elections in an international level, it's using the United Nations legal framework. And at the same time, using the UN legal framework. What we are having is the question of Africa has its own laws as well. We have an African Charter on Human and People's Rights that came in the 1969, but only came into force in 1986. And there again, we have a clause that allows Africans to freely participate in electing their political representatives. Now, the issue is that elections, there's a problem, Thabo. One media commentator used to say elections in Africa becomes selections, meaning people select their own families, their own friends to can co-govern their state. But like I have said earlier, it is questionable that are our leaders sleeping? Are they in a deep sleep not to understand this neo-colonial project of democracy, elections, and governance that is aided and funded by the international multinational corporations and as well as multinational institutions? Now, if one look back again, I've said that there are 3 amendments that are now before Parliament. One is around Electoral Act. One is around the Local Government Act, dealing with elections. In most of the African countries and in the world, the demarcations, limitations, the delimitations or border demarcation, that in itself gives a light to what we call a voter's roll. And that is a highly contested document in elections. Who is eligible to vote? You can have nominations as well. That's a critical aspect as well. IEC now has to determine which province can register as a political party. You've got political parties who are either in the left or in the right who want to register and they are being denied. So you ask yourself, is Section 19 under question? Political rights, are they under question in this country in terms of our own constitution? In terms of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which this country has ratified, domesticated, but how many of our political parties understand the African Charter on Human and People's Rights? Let alone, 9 years ago, there was another charter on the African Charter on Democracy, Election, and Governance. Actually, that's where you find in that document broadly, which South Africa was taking a lead in the draft of that key document to be used by more than 54 countries now. And in that charter, there are issues that talks about political governance, social governance, economic governance. It talks about democratic elections, periodic. We cannot skip elections because there is somebody who has his own preferred candidate and one has to wait. If you look, the South Sudan have an over-delayed elections. There have never been elections in that land of John Garang. If you look at a country like Libya, Tripoli, there have never been elections since Gaddafi was killed by the neo-colonial powers. If you look back in South Africa, there's a talk going on the street, either on Twitter, Facebook, or in the media, that synchronize the local government elections. Others, they say, but don't you need constitutional amendment for that? Quite true. But the parliament, the constitution is under review because last year in June, there was a judgment that has pushed parliament to amend the Electoral Act and allow independent candidates to can contest national elections, which we can even call national, provincial. And in my winding up, Thabo, the issue that comes very deep in all these issues that I have now picked up, I've picked up that we have lost to understand the theory of politics, the theory of elections in this country, because we have not studied people like Achiwa Hamafeje. We have not studied Antonin Mzwakele Mbede. We have not studied people like Unkuputse Abraham Ramutibitiro. We have not studied most of our theorists and thinkers, activists on understanding democratization of politics, of elections, of governance, and how do we break them down in our languages using the power of radio? What then is the role of universities if we are even struggling to understand pandemic of coronavirus? And we have elections and even governance, because remember that the local government elections as well, if we have to look in most of the African countries, they go in what we call harmonized elections that happen in Zimbabwe, where you go on presidential, parliamentary, and local government. In some instances, say we are saving the money because electoral management body cannot have two elections in a row of between 2 and 3 years. In South Africa, we are mooting for the local government elections, provincial and even national, to go as a synchronized or what they called harmonized elections. Challenge is that we have incapable developmental state of local government. The local government, that's where governance has failed. And it has failed since 1995. Our local government has been paralyzed. It has been infiltrated by what? By greed, corruption, lack of knowledge, and at the same time, it has been corrupted by not understanding African theory of politics and elections. And if one has to close, Thabo, I don't know if one has to close in this format of saying, we see the issue of the term limits and the age of political representation or political representative in our liberation movements across Africa, beyond Museveni, Ngwesu, Paul Biya, beyond all these leaders in the African continent who are having this appetite of power. Where is the national consciousness of Fanon? Because Fanon really warned us. Because Fanon really warned us about this new elites that will rise. Frantz Fanon could understand the issue of national consciousness. And if, as the Black consciousness movement, the Pan-Africanist movement, cannot see the issue of merging their theory of understanding this neo-colonial project that I've mentioned earlier, that we have to unmask the neo-colonial project of democracy and elections because it has not worked for our own communities. It has become periodical. Every after 5 years, people have to cast their vote. There's to be voter education of just showing people to just do an X or to do the right. And so it has become a facade of a neo-colonial project being continued by even our own leaders, our own liberation movement. The CODESA 1, CODESA 2, Kempton Park, in their framework of understanding electoral democracy, created the Chapter 9 institutions. But are all Chapter 9 institutions dealing with the issues of governance, democracy, and elections with passion, commitment to our own communities? They are not. The budgets of these Chapter 9s are very poor. It's only IEC that is heavily funded, and that money goes to the political elites, which is political movements that are in parliament. And the parliament is built on a wrong footing as well, because legislations that are in the apartheid governments, in neo-colonial parliaments, they are still perpetuating that democratic project of the Washington Consensus of 1998. Because that's where, if one has to define as well the electoral space in Africa and why we are still facing rejections of election results, we still have disputes of elections, we still have a misgovernance or bad governance in electoral management, we still have a shrinking democratic space where in some countries you only have 52% or 54% of population voting, and you have 18 million people and you have only 10 million. That is the case study of Uganda. And if one looks broadly, Thabo, I think that's where I'll have my parting shot with one quote that was done by Professor Herbert Vilakazi. And I think this one, it is just taking back our young people of this country to understand the electoral democracy 1994 project. Because if you don't understand the 1996 project, I mean the 1994 project of this country in terms of elections, the late Professor Herbert Vilakazi once said that electoral management, meaning managing democracy and elections in any country, it has never been perfect, because democracy is like an education. It's a process that is never fully or perfectly realized. There is always an aspect of it to be improved or even radically altered. So Professor Vilakazi said you need a total reboot, that even if democratic institutions like parliament, like Chapter 9s, they are not efficient, they have to be moved. They have to be reviewed. It is the same like the electoral system that was drafted by a settler intellectual called Frederick van Slaber, that we are still caught up with an Afrikaner thinking that it seems that Africans cannot think. We cannot think deeper to can say, but as Africans, we know that electoral systems are flawed, and they need a public engagement, public participation. There is no way you draft any document without public engagement. Now, your Frederick van Slaber, if some of our viewers and listeners this afternoon can remember him, he was involved in many secret meetings with the ANC. So if one looks at that broader view, our electoral system cannot be crafted by the same political elites who are going to be focusing only on their constituency, focusing only on their friends and families, and forgetting the continental sacred project of how do we liberate the mind of an African child. And that's where I think the issue of elections, democracy beyond 2021, for some of us, we see the COVID will still continue ravaging this continent, and elections will go on. You've got Benin coming, Chad, Ethiopia. There are many elections that will be held this year in the African continent. And those elections will be held under the cloud of COVID-19. So there's no need for us to say our local government should be shifted, because you will need a constitutional amendment, and our institutions have been operating online. They've never been going to parliament as they've been doing. Public hearings are limited to this. One can call it a privileged spaces, because to be on Zoom, Skype, Facebook, all these things are for the privileged, but the rural majority, our communities of practice, they hardly have access to this. Not only that there is no data or Wi-Fi, but because they are people of human interaction. They have Ubuntu. They want to see things. They want to hear from political representatives. So even if people campaign through social media, those elections in Uganda have shown the growth of Bobby Wine as a reggae artist, by the way, because they say he was a music tent parliamentarian, but he was a reggae artist. And reggae always talks social issues. Now, Bobby Wine has garnered support now with almost 34%, almost 3 million young people using social media. So for some of us, we think our liberation movements like PAC, AZAPO must not be shy to use these public spaces, but they should always ground, like what Walter Rodney will say, grounding with my brethren. So we need to ground with our communities on a consistent basis on these theories of understanding this neo-colonial project of post-colonial that Thabo I've mentioned. I think I will just pause there so that I can allow interaction. I know I've taken more time, but the issue was the train of thought. But just to again remind our viewers and listeners what Haile Selassie said, that democracy is very harmful and it's a mistake in the African continent.
Sure, Ras Gideon. Listening to you, you made me remember that I neglected to introduce myself at the beginning of this session. So my name is Thabo, so I'll be the host for this session. So Ras, what I'm understanding from your input now, and especially when you quoted Professor Vilakazi, who sort of, I think for me, is crystallize the issue. What you are contesting is two things. You are contesting the concept of democracy in the abstract, so conceptually, and you are contrasting it with a lived reality, particularly the lived reality of Africans and working people. So let's first go to sort of this conceptual analysis bit. What would you define as like key elements or things that constitute the framework for democracy? Because we know liberal democracies as they exist, there are certain things that define their framework. It's the issue of legitimacy, that the government must be elected by a majority of people through an open and fair electoral process. It's the issue of freedom, that people must be free to make certain choices and so on. It's the issue of power, that those who are elected must have power defined through a constitution and in a way constrained. And then there is the issue of justice, that there must be a rule of law, and no one should be, human rights and so forth. So those would constitute the key framework that would understand in terms of liberal democracy, or democracy as it currently is understood. And what you are postulating is that democracy can be hijacked. So what would be those key elements for you, and what would be those mechanisms that you suggest could help any democratic practice or any governance from being hijacked, either by neoliberalists or by neocolonialists and so on, so that it can truly be a system that gives power to the people?
No, correctly, Tabiso, and I apologize for Captain saying Thabo. Mafrika, what I think, which is very critical, is that in some instances, democracy has become autocracy. And in your Arab state or in your northern part, they used to use the word theocracy. Now, if you look at why I started with Haile Selassie and went to Anthony Mzwakele Mbeki, that was the key point I was driving home. That Mbeki emphasized the people-centered power. That's where the issue of Black consciousness, the Pan-Africanism project have to be people's power, people-driven, not leaders-driven. not regime security driven. Because democracy, by the way, is policed, securitized, is under intelligence, is under a multinational project. Hence, I say to you, democracy of the West has got market-driven value. You see that when there are elections, foreign embassies are concerned about the markets. They are not concerned about the value of lives and the change that people must go through. Now, Limbede emphasized the issue of what people banibata lekotla, ibandla, inkundla. And I don't want to come up with an apartheid model of chieftainship, where even the ANC government has failed in its 27 years to redefine the role of our kings and queens in this country. They have failed to define. You can have chapter 12 that talks about traditional leadership, talks about customary law, but it is flawed again, because our constitution, again, on its democratic values, it was drafted by the elites of the UCT, by the way. Those legal minds of UCT were drafting our so-called democratic values, that they still continue to use what Sobukwe challenged. You can't be saying the non-racial, non-democratic, non-sexist. So for some of us, when we think deeper in our thinking cap, in our thinking beres, we say Sobukwe reminded us, Limbede reminded us that democratic values, it's still embedded in the spirit of Ubuntu, Botho Barona. You know, the issue of leadership, there are people who are not only born for being leaders, but there are people who have been trained, who go for school, but I'm going to do political science, I'm going to do political studies, I'm going to do business management. But in our African context, I think even in AZAPO, you've got what we call grounded intellectual towers, who didn't go to even university, but they are grounded towers because they can stand even the test of the wind. They can stand on the test of the rains. So for us, even if I have done a lot of democratic practices in university, trying to define democracy, as you were saying, the issue of liberal democracy, again, like I said to you, it is imposed, by the way. It is a must. You must subscribe to it. You must conform. You must conform to it so that you can get funding from the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. You must get money from a certain donor because you are even promoting elections, democracy. You want peace. You want the rule of law. That is the attitude that the neo-colonial project is holding. But now the African conception now is that, I mean, it is that the liberation movement, when they came back from exile, some of them came from even Tanzania, from Zambia, Ethiopia. They should have grounded the young activists and young minds of today about defining African democracy. We should not have subscribed to democracy only defined by chapter 1 of our own constitution about values. And even in the continent, the way you have said it earlier, it is using liberal standard. It uses liberal standard because they want to be out of the sanctions. We saw with Emerson Mnangagwa, after he won elections, he went back to the US, he went back to the Commonwealth. So you can see that democracy dictates even economic benefits. Hence, there is a say that where there are too many feats, there are too many benefits that must accrue to this political elite. So, decolonizing democracy, it will be a long-term project for our young intellectuals in this country to say, how do we understand democratization process, developmental state governance? How do we understand the so-called election fever? Because we're always on the fever of it. Ultimately, we'll be under the fever of COVID-19, of elections. So we might be under that cloud of that we define democracy only by 5-year term. And some of us, we say, it is not the proper one when Thabo is so, because even if you can try to redefine, the problem is that they have rubber stamped these values, the liberal remote controllers or handlers. They have made sure that even our liberation movement subscribe to their thinking. Hence, I use the issue of our electoral system in this country was drafted by an Afrikaner intellectual, as they will perceive. And I know that there were African minds in that committee, but I don't want to insult or assault their thinking. But it cannot be led by an African intellectual who was part of the system.
Yeah. So I think Professor Vilikazi crystallized when he said democracy is never fully realized. I think that is important to understand.
Yeah.
That as human beings, we ourselves are on a continuous process of evolution, a process of understanding certain things better. But at the same time, whilst we are trying to evolve to a better state, there are those who are trying to make sure that they capture whatever state we achieve for their own benefit. So as a policy analyst, I want us to also look at certain elements where we are saying, if we are to make this democracy responsive, there's something that you said which sort of resonated with me, where you said elections supersede governance. I think that's an important thing, where the notion of free and fair elections seems to be the start and the end. How people govern, or how parties govern, and how they use those resources, there's no sharp focus on them. And I think it should be a continuous thing. So if we can look at what are those interventions, bearing in mind what Professor Vilakazi said about that we are on this pursuit of zero defect. There used to be an advert that says pursuit for zero defect, with the full understanding that as human beings, we can never have a situation where we have zero defect. So let's start with the electoral system, especially as we have it in South Africa. I think the judgment of the Constitutional Court last year was also in pursuit of that zero defect, by allowing individuals to stand in their own right so that they can be voted for. What other measures would you suggest that we put in place so that we have a democratic system that is responsive to the populace?
Son of the Soil Tower, thank you. What I will add maybe is the point that you are raising, that our electoral system, our electoral management body, IEC, it has been facing litigation, I can say to you, since 2013, 14. You remember earlier when I started, I said one of the critical elements in these elections is always the voters' roll. You might, in most of the African countries, they know even how to put those who have passed on, the dead corpse. So you'll have the ghost voters,
Yeah.
And then at the voters' roll again, you can have duplicates that are going in different polling stations. Now, you remember the Tlokwe judgment, how it clearly challenged the issue of the address and the role of political representative if they want to campaign. It goes back to the issues of demarcations once more. Now, for us to be coming up with a responsive one, this judgment that came last year, again, it was almost, since 2018, this matter was at the Cape Town High Court. A person contesting the elections of 2019, saying that he wanted to be an independent candidate, provincial. And this is a party that was not from liberation forces, but you can think that their role was to look at accountability. That if we have a constitution and electoral system of a party representative or a PR system, constituency-based, it means communities, even if there is a certain president being elected, it will be the party preference. Whether the party, they've got 1 million members, they've got 2 or 3 million members, that leader will lead 52 million people. And that's where our electoral system, you don't have to debate electoral system when you are in an electoral cycle or election fever. we need to start to think. It goes back to Ntate Achimafejo, when you have to understand the theory of practice on elections and as well as the theory of understanding governance. Now you have a local government sphere that came late in 1995. That is a sphere which I will always feel that we have ignored for many years. Whether it's the by-elections, it's the local government elections, but we have ignored the question of accountability in that area, Tabis. We have, and I think most of the people who are viewing this, they might disagree or agree, but they know very well that at the local government level, that's where we see corruption at the cold front. Provincial level, national level. So the issue of governance, again, like we have saying, resources, that's one of the electoral trigger that. Having observed elections in most of the African countries, the use of the state resource during election fever or campaigns, it is a norm, it's a ritual, it is normalized. It is normalized by any ruling or governing party. They can come it with different ways. They say, these are the food parcels, we were on a project for social development, but there is something that is coming. You look at your national commemorative days in this country. When you are in an election year, the national commemorative days, whether it's June 16, Soweto Day, Shabilanga Massacre, a theme subscribes to the governing party's manifesto. It doesn't subscribe to the nation soul or the spirit of the nation. That's where we have missed it again. That we have made elections and democracy project as if it is the alpha and omega, you know. And some of us, when you say, what is then an alternative governance? What is then an alternative system that we can look at? Like I've said, Tabiso, you don't discuss electoral system when you are on the fever. You don't engage it on the media. You don't engage it on the Facebook. It has to be engaged in the intellectual reservoir or an intellectual public hearing space, where even Limwa now was 18 years, Limme Omutuna was 50 years or was 60 years, our elders, they can pick up the pieces and give advice because they know more. They've been disenfranchised. Remember, we are a country in this country. I mean, we are a country that comes out of a disenfranchised period for many years, since beginning of the union. So being enfranchised or being franchised in 1994, given a vote, the power to vote, that power to vote, we might have abused it. We might have even misused it. And now negligence lies with, again, our political representative, our parliamentarians. They have their constituency-based. But those constituency-based, they become a political party branch office. It doesn't become a community office where we can understand what's happening in the provincial parliament of Gauteng. The same like municipalities, what is happening in the chambers of your Gauteng, Tshwane, Ekurhuleni. We don't know what is happening in those chambers. So that's where I feel that there is a vacuum, there is a disconnection, there is a loss of signal somewhere of the electorates and political representatives.
As you were saying that you know, the issue of the Electoral Act and the electoral reform is not something that should be engaged with during the heat of the electoral campaign. So this platform is one of those tools that we are using so that we can garner people's thoughts and whatever advices from analysts like you, whatever interventions that can be put in place to ensure that we strive towards that zero defect. Democracy to come, as it were, to paraphrase Professor Vilakazi. Let me invite comrades, friends, to ask questions and to participate. Those on Zoom can go to the chat function of Zoom and ask their questions, or let me know and then I'll allow them to speak. Those on our Facebook pages can also type questions there. As as we go along, I'll keep on going to our Facebook page to see if there are any questions that are put there, so that we can address those as we go along. So Africa, the issue of elections and governance, I think it's an important one. Governance should benefit the majority of the people, or the people of that country. But as I think, as you rightfully say, in certain instances, it has failed dismally to do so, partly because of, one, our leaders, those who are in power, lack the sort of consciousness and conscience that would allow them to serve the interest of the people. And most of them tend to use the parties to be vehicles for their own self-enrichment. And even the parties as well tend to sort of have a will of their own, in that they become self-serving. And the primary thing is their own stature and them remaining in power. Hence, the issues around demarcation and people gerrymandering or maneuvering the borders, so that they are able to ensure that they continue to have that. What I'll continue to press you on, Africa, is alternatives. What can we do to improve the system? So let me test your view on this one. One of the issues, I think, that in South Africa and generally across the world, is that once a party is elected, the populace, the electorate generally has very little power to engage government. Even when we have notions of participatory democracy, like the advert you were mentioning, that's in the City Press on the where they're asking for public participation. I think it says something like 3 days from now, that's when they are closing. The issue
towards the end of the month,
Oh, it's closing towards the end of the month. So even those opportunities for people to participate tend to privilege those who have resources and so forth. So what would you say around the issue of the people themselves having the ability to recall politicians in government, so that if people fail to do so, then the people have the ability to recall so your thoughts on that?
Thabo, so people will recall, and some of our viewers and listeners, they will recall that there was this issue of floor crossing at some point, which the PACL, they used to call it political prostitution of members of parliament moving from one party to the other. Now, if you look at the issue of saying, yes, how do we have public participation? We have a constitution that is very clear. It is abstract, it is logic, it is clear to say whenever parliament is doing anything, they must always have public consultation. And remember, it's not to tick the box, it's not to call public consultations in the hotels and you say we have done public consultation. The duty to consult, it lies within people taking decisions in a certain program or a project that they will want to be seen being implemented. Because the real purpose, we say, in an African democracy, so maybe in short, is the material survival and conditions, the livelihoods of our people to be at the state where it should have been before colonialism or neo-colonialism. Before there was apartheid, before there was even democratic space project, our people should have been in that state of being at a peaceful space, because the notion that we are raising of free and fair elections in our vocab, in my intellectual labor work I've been doing at UNISA as an intellectual laborer, we have been desisting to use the word free and fair, because we said elections are either credible, transparent, legitimate, and like you said, those are the values. But if there's no public participation, there's voter apathy. The young people tells you that, why don't you send us just SMS and we will vote for you? There's no longer these issues of queuing. there are no issues of going to the rallies and listening to the manifestos. Manifestos tend to become numbers, and numbers become numbers in terms of greediness of eating the public funds. Because the manifesto in our local government elections, in our national government elections, provincial, presidential, must talk to the issues that even our community have the power to use, like the petitions committee. You ask yourself in parliament, how many people use that certain process of even petition in parliament? How many of our people even understand that even members of parliament have a duty to always go to their communities? It reminds me of John Garang. He says, you don't ask people to come to town, take the town to the people. So even governance and politics, as we are activists, intellectuals, politicians, we must not always think that the knowledge must sit only in the parliaments, because those democratic institutions, like I've said to you, they were built on the wrong footing. They were built on the wrong foundation of a neo-colonial state. And that's where I learned from Kwesi Pra yesterday to say, actually, all our leaders are sitting on a ticking time bomb. Even before coronavirus, our leaders were still far from understanding reality of that they are in a neo-colonial project. So that's where when you think of even our liberation movements, to say our mass democratic movements, so we see our leaders when they speak nowadays, they read too much. They don't even look as like upright, They don't contextualize manifestos. They want to go to their iPad. You want to scroll on their iPad. He wants to read. When he goes on a TV, radio, you don't hear them. But what is the thinking point here? What is the strategy? How do we give our communities a thinking? And that's what reminds me of Professor Patrice Lumumba. You say, our leaders have iPads, but our children in villages, they don't have sanitary pads. So you ask yourself, if our leaders cannot think deeper about public participation, so it is not a favor. It is not, and even that's where our people must empower themselves by saying that we can hold them accountable, but again, there's apathy, there is favoritism, there is promises which have been breached, by the way. There's a breach of promises during elections. I wonder if there were many courts that have to say how many political parties have breached their promise to fulfill, not to marry, by the way, just to say you have breached the promise to can bring water to us, you have breached this promise to bring sanitation, but we have been going to this cohabitation, and we have allowed our people to be raped by political representation.
Yeah. So we have some comments and some questions on our Facebook page. Patrick Festus says we must crush this demagogue of political elite first, and the people will follow through mass education, period. Comrade Siabo is asking a question where he says, in SA, there are multiple parties that seem to mushroom at every election. Is this democracy or political entrepreneurship? Your thoughts on that? Is this democracy?
Thabo, I would want you to bring the first one, but this last one, look at our elections 2019. We had how many political parties? We had more than 48, and only 14 went to the parliament, So the issue of the rise of new political parties is again political rights. It is your political right to form your party. You have a freedom of association to form your own party and to be elected as well, to can canvass, campaign. So in some instances, when I see the rise of many political parties, you can see the rise of multi-party democracy. I was reading something coming from the late Daniel Arap Moi from Kenya. Daniel Arap Moi in the early 60s was skeptical about the rise of multi-party democracy. You'll remember Zambia was pro the one party state. They seem like Tanzania. But when the issue of the multi-party democracy comes in, people felt threatened. But Arap Moi at a later stage changed his thinking, say, but really this opposition, they are actually keeping us awake in parliament. They are actually sitting on our toes to implement programs. You are no longer sleeping in the parliament. You are no longer rubber stamping colonial laws. We are now making change to the lives of our communities. So that's where I can answer in that fashion, that in some instance, multi-party democracy, it has allowed even extremists to come into the space, to either pollute the space, and again, what we call coalition politics. We see that during elections, you have parties that just become relevant for elections, and after elections, they disappear. They just disappear from the political discourse in the country. They can exist by name, but you don't hear where they are. Your Mampele Rampele's parties, you know, they came and passed, you know, and it is sad, being the former wife of Bantu Biko, where he went on to set up an organization with a liberal movement like DA, you know, and at the same time pull out, you know. And maybe, Tabiso, if you can remind me of the first one, because I was just reading another comment that was coming on the Zoom.
Okay, so
the first one, yeah.
The first one where it says, we must crush this demagogue political elite first, and the people will follow through mass education.
Yeah. It goes back to what me and you have been resonating on, the late Professor Herbert Vilagasi, on education, African-centered education, how we can try to employ our African theories of understanding democracy. Yes, demagogues will always be there. Political bigots will always be there. Political fagots will always be there. And you cannot move them away, because the nature of politics is that it becomes participatory. Even those who were part of the apartheid system, who were part of the neo-colonial project, they always contest power as well. Because one thing that I forgot to raise, and which has been my mantra always, I always say, Tabiso, elections and politicians, they forget that elections is a political trigger. I mean, it's a conflict trigger. Because what do? We are contesting for political power. Robert Nesta Marley said they're always fighting for power, but they don't know the hour. Now, this political power, yes, we want political representation. That is the key element, to say we want to elect a representation. That's where elections become sacrosanct, become sacred, becomes the center. But again, it is a trigger of conflict. It's a push and a pull factor. The other one might not accept outcome. Even we see how many liberation movements, they are in factions. When they are an elective conference, whether it's PAC, AZAPO, ANC, there are factions and there are conflicts in those electoral process. But it is not a conflict of ideas. It is not a battle of ideas, you know, of what Che Guevara will have said, that the battle of ideas, the assassination of Lumumba, as we were talking about today, that those eras of Lumumba, Botsietsi, and Unkgopotse, the battle was of the thinking, of the ideas. It was not of the numbers. It was not of the food parcels. So you have political parties who rely on the food parcels, who rely on giving people data, who rely on flying people all over. And they think that this is our political messengers or saviors. And that's where we have a problem of even our education system at school, our primary education system. If we want to teach social science or politics, why must we have one narrative? Why must we have one narrative of the ANC? Because I have to be brutal there, so why must we have an issue that is the ANC that has brought liberation in this country? You know, why should we have a narrative that it was only those who were in exile who have brought liberation in this country? And we want to groom these young leaders, these young people, to become leaders of today and tomorrow. And at the start, our curriculum is flawed and fraught as well, because once you don't have electoral democracy at basic education level, never mind university. If I can tell you university, what the mother bodies are doing, you can say it is a second variant of COVID-19.
Just explain what you just said a little bit more, Comrade, where you say if you don't have electoral democracy at school, then the system is flawed. What do you mean?
I mean that our curriculum system, how do we structure our basic education courses, modules, that if young people at the age of 10, 15, they don't understand democracy in our own context, they don't understand politics, and we only want them to go and study them at high school when they do history, sometimes what used to be known as history, social science, and then when he goes to even university, when he chooses to say, I want to go and do politics, I want to go and do law, then he starts to meet with this strange concept of democracy and elections, you know. And all along he has been canvassed to say you must vote. Remember that you have the right to vote. You must remember you have an ID. Another aspect, the use of an ID, that when you have an ID card, you have the power to vote. You can go and register. The issue of that identity, again, it has caused many conflicts in African countries, because it is the voter card in most of the African countries that allows people to be known that have you voted or not. Even the ink that has been used as a sign to say those who are non-political, who don't want to go and vote. Like I can tell you, most of the Rastafarians, in my own thinking, in my own space, they don't even subscribe to elections. You'll never see 50 or 100 Rastas queuing, saying we'll go for the election. And there is the reason for that, because they have not trust. There's a deficit, there's a lack of education, of understanding election. Hence, I'm saying that's where we have the challenge. And when I raise universities, I say election democracy, even at the university level, you find student movements in university emulate and copy and paste what the mother body is doing. What is happening in parliament, they want to do it even in the university space. Yeah. You know, if they are howling in parliament, people are fighting in parliament, and there's corruption going on, even when they're in the SRC, they continue. Hence I said, I use that analogy of the variant of COVID-19, that what the first wave is doing to the mother bodies, the student movements in universities and high schools, they become the second variant of that COVID-19.
Yeah. So we are in the last session of our time together, African, and I would like us to maybe start zeroing in and summing our discussion, and then in that summation pull out things that let's say we would want comrades to go and mobilize around, would want comrades to go and agitate for, and so forth. So as I said, I like Professor Vilakazi's quote, and because I think it gives us a context and the framework of this notion that democracy is never fully realized. So in heading towards a conclusion, given that democracy is never fully realized and that we are constantly in pursuit of this, when we look at those elements that form the framework of what liberal democracy stands for, legitimacy, do we have a problem with the notion that those in government should have a certain legitimacy that is born out of them having received the majority of support from the electorate, thus getting the mandate to govern? Is there something that is fundamentally wrong with that notion?
No. I don't think there's something fundamental. And I think that's a very good point that you are raising, a very good analysis that I think our comrades in Africa must go and interrogate it further, because I've raised the issue of voter apathy. And in some instances, people say, but if you have not voted, we have been voted into power by, even if it can be 50% of the population, like I was using the case study of Uganda. Legitimacy again goes with accountability. You have people who will opt not to go and vote, say, will feel that even if we go and vote, we'll do the spoil vote. And we know there are people who go to the ballot,
Yeah.
I mean, to the polling stations to just go put 3 or 4 X's in the same party. I mean, in various parties, just to say that I'm not happy with what I'm seeing. And remember, this person again, he or she waits for 4 years all the time to say, I will wait for 4 years to audit them. And the last year, when they can campaign, I want to get their audit report. What is it that they've done? What is it that they will improve? Because what Professor Villaga said in my thinking is to say, we can improve our African democratization project by resisting and desisting the neo-colonial project of Western democracy values. Because the Western democracy values makes our people to become political objects. It makes our people to become political slaves. They become slaves of the electoral systems that they don't know. And secondly, I've emphasized on the issue of understanding concepts, that if you don't understand what democracy or republic signifies, like you have a country like this one called Tanzania, that it is still, even after 1994, using the word Republic of South Africa, the travel document, the passport still in French, still in English. So you ask yourself that where is politicization or consciousness?
Yeah.
Thirdly, as we were paying tribute to Patrice Lumumba reminds us of our historical past and present and future. Patrice Lumumba reminds us of human dignity, justice, to say, if we want social justice, if we want independence, because remember that politics, it is all about striving for sovereignty, independence, governance, all those aspects. It is important for comrades Namatawa not to only read these philosophers I've mentioned this afternoon, Abo Lumumba, Anthony Mzwake Limbede, Mangaliso Sobukwe, Professor Herbert Villagasi, Haile Selassie speech of 1974 on the 23rd or on the 24th of June, when he was specifically asked on the question of what is your opinion on democracy? And his inference and his thinking was that democracy in Africa is harmful and is a mistake. Remember, this is one of your founding member of the Organization of African Unity, because if our comrades are not united, like I've emphasized this afternoon, that the PAC and AZAPO, what Biko have said, that it is important for PAC and AZAPO to be in one accord in terms of understanding this project of democracy, how it was imposed, how it was hijacked, how it was shipped, how it was imposed through the Frederick van Slabert report. I will urge people even not to go into that report with a conscience that it will bring some hope. They need to go and unbundle it, delete it where they know that some words are not correct, and put the wording that will resonate with our own social movements or our own communities. Because one aspect that I've emphasized is that public participation, it is not for us to only be in the formal meetings. It is in many forms now. People are on these social media circles, and this political education, I think, it is coming at the right moment, as today we were engaging even on elections in the African continent, to be saying that beyond 2021, you will still have elections in this African continent, whether there is COVID-19 or COVID-21 or COVID-20. Elections is a market-driven project. Elections is political elites' space to can contest for power. That's what I've emphasized today.
Yeah.
I've emphasized even the role of understanding the African instruments, that even if you have the UN instruments about civil and political rights, that you have the right to vote, you have the right to be voted into power, but we've got our own African document that I've mentioned today. We've got African Charter on Human and People's Rights of 1986. And finally, we've got the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance of 2012. So those are the key instruments that Towers Nama Africa, if they can peruse them, browse them, it will sanitize their thinking, you know, about elections, democracy, and governance. Even if I have said to you, the African democracy is something we have to build as a long-term project. Governance, it has to be people's governance. It has to be people's driven governance. Yeah. Traditional institutions, because community institutions, community organizations, the mass democratic movements have to be given the power to speak. The role of the media, I think today I've emphasized even on the role of media.
Yeah, for those who might have missed the beginning, particularly after your initial presentation, I think one of the things that we agreed on was that your critique is the critique of practice, not necessarily the critique of the concept of governing by the people and the government having the necessary legitimacy in governing with justice and fairness, and governing with the interest of the people at heart, and with delivering and making sure that you are the true agent of those people. One other thing that I also want to test with you is when you look at the articles, the African Union articles on election and democracy, they also emphasize the notions of justice, legitimacy, human rights, rule of law, and making sure that power is exercised in a manner that is clearly defined and constrained by the constitution of the various countries. So constitutionalism is still an element that is upheld within those. When you critique some of those things and then you say we must go back to the articles, sometimes I struggle to align some of the critique and what you are pointing us to. So can you say a bit on that?
Tabiso, I will, but on the Zoom, I see there are two questions coming from Tawa Kolo, Dr. Selohalani. But you see, when I critique, the issue is to make our viewers and our towers to can see that one critiques, even if you are inside. Remember that they say even if you are inside, you must wear like them this time. You must just look like them, but there must be a way where you must rebel and you must just revolt on your thinking. You have these existing documents, but in our critique, it is that when I say they must peruse them, I mean that they must review them as well. They must have their own critique. Yeah. Because my critique it is that what Kolo is saying here, he says outside electoral process, what other processes do or should define democracy. I think, again, I've said election is a vehicle to democracy. Democratization of spaces, again, relies on the good governance. You know, democratic institutions are being established through elections. Hence, we have a periodic elections that every after 5 years, there must be elections. And that's where you have representation. And beyond that, I think I will pause there because I will want to maybe to take Dr. Khalani as well, his views.
Yeah, let's take Dr. Khalani's question that says Parliament have been legal barriers between peoples and the exercise of authority, excluding masses from power, while usurping sovereignty in their place. What is Ras's view on this?
Yeah, no, Mafrika Pula. But again, before I answer him, you know, when he started, he has quoted one of the revolutionaries from Libya, Colonel Gaddafi, to say that Colonel Gaddafi talks about the dictatorship of democracy. In the same instance, I can say to him, the dictatorship of parliamentary supremacy have been replaced by the dictatorship of constitutional supremacy. What you have is that during apartheid, Parliament was used as the cannon fodder. It was used as the buffer zone. Now, in the new democratic space, you see a constitutional court instructing parliament, Tabiso, to say amend the law. The law the law it is not correct. The law it is defective. Rectify the law. Before it used to be parliament instructing the courts to punish, to pass unjust laws. You know, now we see a 360-10, where if you look at the role of parliament, again, in some instance, we find parliament undermining constitutional clauses of this constitution. Case in point, when you say parliament has become the legal barrier, for me, I can say parliament has become only the opium of the, not only the masses, but the opium of its own constituency. You know, so in some instance, I feel that, I know that we are talking of parliament, and at the moment we had freezed a bit, you know, there was some freezing between me and you.
Yes.
So that issue of the role of parliament, I've emphasized it earlier, that parliament have to go to the people. Parliament must not be a constituency based of political parties only. It must not be that only Section 25, we saw parliament being active only through the hearings of our state-owned enterprise. That's where we see parliament being active. There is a need for this parliament not to become an elite-driven, because that's where, so it goes back to that project of a neo-colonial democracy, that the role of political parties and opposition, it is all about getting into power and forget about the masses or the population or electorates. And that's how I can raise that issue. But again, I fully agree with him about what Gaddafi said about demarcation of voting zones and the practice of democracy. He's questioning further to say, in some instances, is this undemocratic? I will say to him, not really, because they will justify spatial planning. They say, but community A was bound to go to that area. We were planning to even relocate them to go and start Ward 2. Community A comes from Ward 1, and they tell them that, no, you are going to be in Ward 2 now. So even demarcations of many of our African countries, they are a bit Western driven, so they sometimes demarcate through the street, through the, I don't know how they don't understand African tradition, that we used to demarcate through the river, through the mountain. But now they demarcate through a street, demarcate through a certain class that is sitting in that area, that those ones, and in some instances, that's how politics have become, that the rural votes have given more governing parties more votes. In some instances, the urban people are starting to change, so in terms of looking at politics and looking at elections, people are starting to become clearer and their minds are open about politics of elections.
Yeah, so we are now at that time where we invite you, Ras, to share with us a few of your closing remarks, and then so that we can bid our comrades farewell.
And I want to thank everyone who have engaged with us and for your invitation as well, because I thought this was more of a refresher from my side to say, if we look back at elections, democracy, governance beyond 2021, is to just look at those historical issues that I've raised, theoretical, most of them, and others being practical, that is things that we know, that we see. And I think for us to pay tribute to Patrice Lumumba this afternoon, for me, it has become relevant in the sense that most of the African countries are going through bad governance. Elections are becoming violent. DRC have been having violence of elections time and again since 2006. And I think for me, what they can take away from this session is to debunk the concept and the myth of Western democracy, is to debunk the myth of that elections will bring hope and change, because it is still a colonial project. The issues of governance, I've emphasized, they are multinational and international driven market. You have people who have a certain agenda on them, and we should not run away from that. They should understand that the issues of governance, they are falling squarely within your multinational companies, your international organization, that in their frame, they want to see Africa being peaceful, but at the same time, they are selling weapons to this continent. We have conflict in Mozambique, in Somalia, in Mali. And I think I've emphasized about elections that are coming in this country. I mean, in South Africa, local government elections that it might not be, it is premature, probably to be pushing for the amendment, but always people have rights in parliament to can amend to come with their bills, what they call member bill, where people can change electoral system. But my critique is that, or argument, or even submission is that you don't argue electoral amendment during election fever or heat. And I think I've emphasized on the views of Professor Herbert Vilakazi on understanding electoral management system, Professor Chima Feje as well, a person who has dealt with the history of this country. He has edited actually the book that looked at the history of elections in South Africa, Professor Achi Wahama Feje. So for me, I think those are my pillars of understanding African democracy, elections, governance. And like to say, even under COVID-19, under this virus, the issues around the right to healthcare, they are part of the political manifestos. So we should not even say under COVID, we should just focus on COVID and forget. Even the issues of healthcare, they are part of the governance aspect, you know. Even election of a minister of health, if we nominate a minister of health, we have confidence in him, we have trust on him. Debates on even vaccine are becoming heated. South Africa should become a public debating country rather than relying on social media politics, relying not in reading and listening to radio and watching critical TV debates. Because what we have missed in this country is those political sessions and debates. Our people are not listening to different talk shows on radio, because that's where you will pick up knowledge on a daily basis from different multidisciplinary think tankers. Because I don't think I've got authority of what I've been saying since 1 o'clock. In some instance, it is a spirit that is driving. It is your knowledge, Tabiso, as well. It is the knowledge of everyone who has been part of us this afternoon that makes me to think deeper and to think sometimes inwardly, and in some instance think outwardly, broadly, and not to confine myself with South African politics. Because the more I want to analyze elections of this country, it is the more sometimes I don't become happy, because I've seen in most of the African countries where elections have become a very tedious process, violent, volatile, separating families and even communities. And when I look at this country, I see the same thing happening, and I see people taking politics lightly, saying that we don't care about elections and politics, when actually our lives are managed and controlled by politics. So there's no way you cannot say you don't want to be engaged, you don't want to know more about elections and governance and democracy. So I think those are my parting shots. And once more, the teachings of Haile Selassie are very important on democracy. They are important even on governance, because Haile Selassie looked at the modern Ethiopia in 1935. So even when you think of governance, infrastructure, political schooling, it's very important. It is part of mental infrastructure. People, when you do political school, they are only thinking about money, but they don't know there's a mental infrastructure that you are building, the theory of politics, the theory of the law, the theory of elections, so that we can always question. Because once we don't question, Tabiso, the colonial matrix of power, the rules of the game will never change. The rules of the game will still remain. So we must always question the colonial forces and powers all the time. And that's where those are my parting shots. Asante sana Mafrika Pula.
Thank you, Comrade. And in the spirit of commemorating Patrice Lumumba, I would just like to remind our audience of Steve Biko's continued urging that we need to be agents, we need to be participants in our own liberation, we need to be critically engaged, not only in the actual action, but also in the thought that we need to interrogate all these concepts. And also the view that he espoused of the multi-dimensional aspects of our engagement, that there is nothing preventing one from participating in election, but at the same time critiquing the very same processes that one has engaged in. So as is the objective and the mandate of this platform is to present to our audience multiple views and to ask them to critically engage with those views. And through the various pages of AZAPO, and Africa is widely available, so people can contest what he has said and engage with him, as he, I think, rightfully said, that through this process of engagement, we all grow. So I hope, comrades, in remembering Lumumba, Patrice Lumumba, that this session was a source of growth for all of us. Mafrika, once again, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who joined us for this discussion. Asante sana, as we
Asante sana Mafrika, Pula Mafrika.
Pula. Thank you and goodbye.